town is packed. And there's just a massive party outside of Cucina's. I don't even know what to say anymore. So now that I have to drive really slowly, let's explain that term. And the term for this week is direct provision. This is kind of a hotbed issue because it does come up an awful lot of times in the media, and it has been criticised wildly by human rights groups in particular in the past for putting people in unsafe or very poor conditions, particularly because people who claim asylum in this country are usually from very vulnerable parts of the world. But if you're wondering what direct provision is, direct provision is accommodation for asylum seekers who have not been granted asylum yet. People who come to Ireland and claim asylum are looked after by the International Protection Office and the Minister for Justice and Equality. When they come to Ireland and claim asylum, they have to wait for an interview. So they're brought to a direct provision centre and they have to do 2 interviews. The first interview that takes place has quite a long waiting list. I've read different statistics on it. So sometimes the waiting list can be as long as 19 months. And then I've read other statistics that say on average, people are usually granted asylum after 14 months. So that doesn't make any sense. But the latest one that I read from the Irish Examiner said that the first interview, people can wait up to about 14 weeks, which does make more sense. I may be wrong on that statistic though, so just bear that in mind. Before they're granted asylum and they're put into a direct provision centre, they're given an allowance. So that allowance for adults, per adult, is usually nearly €40, so I think it's 39. And then per child is usually about 30 quid, so I think it's 28 or 29. What they spend it on is completely up to them. It can be anything from food to clothing, school, stationery, books, whatever they need. A direct provision centre will provide the absolute basics, and those basics are a bed to sleep in, a place to shower, somewhere to eat, and the basic food and water. Refugees who come to Ireland and they make their case here can actually have their case be refused, but they can appeal that case as many times as they wish. Just varies from person to person. I doubt if you're coming from a very war-torn or impoverished country that you would want to go back to those countries, so appealing the case for an awful lot of people probably seems like the better option. On average, people are usually granted their asylum within about 14 months, but there are some people who have been in direct provision centres for as long as 12 years. So it is a lengthy process. One of the reasons that people can often be left in direct provision centres for that long is because when someone is granted their asylum, they're immediately put onto the housing list. And as I've discussed before, the housing list in Ireland is extremely long. If you take into account all of the AHBs and different cooperatives who also have people on their housing waiting lists and the local authority housing waiting lists, there's over 100,000 households waiting for housing. So if you want to mix asylum seekers into that, that might be why some people are waiting that long for access to housing. When someone is granted asylum in Ireland, they're granted all of the rights that a European citizen or a member of a state of the EEA has. So they can work, they have their visa, they can access social welfare, they can access social housing if they need to, our healthcare, education, that kind of thing. Because we actually don't have very good access to housing here, an awful lot of people in direct provision centres are being left in limbo, because they're not given accurate times as to when they can actually avail of housing. So unfortunately, an awful lot of people are left guessing. Understandably, it's very difficult for them to also get jobs because their references may not be able to be verified because of the countries that they come from. Or they might be placed in a direct provision centre that's in a very rural area, so there might not be jobs available to them. And considering that the coronavirus has now pushed an awful lot of people out of jobs, there's even less jobs for people to go around. So we're going to have even more people in direct provision centres who are stuck there for a much longer time. One of the most worrying things and the worst things about direct provision is that because direct provision is privatised, these standards vary wildly from centre to centre. When I say direct provision has been privatised, this means that the government pays for it, but they pay external companies to look after people who are in direct provision. So Aramark is a big one. Aramark has a number of direct provision centres and looks after them, and they directly profit off the government paying for direct provision and for people living in these centres. It becomes a particular issue when the standards in certain places become quite egregious. So an awful lot of people have seen pictures of very poor standard washing facilities. The fact that some people are staying in hotels and they're completely left without very basic things such as access to a refrigerator. There was one picture in particular that I saw up on Twitter of rations for children's school lunches that were handed out, and they were frozen, and those rations were a packet of cheese and a packet of chicken slices, but they were given to people who have no refrigerators. So how are they supposed to keep that food fresh? There's also so many stories of people who have been left in direct provision centres for much longer than should be entirely necessary. So, you know, people on waiting lists up to 12 years and 7 years, people who've been there for 5 years, who have had no chance to integrate into the community that they're actually living in. People who have escaped countries because they were penalised for being gay and then being put in a room with someone who's extremely homophobic. It just doesn't make any sense. The issue that I particularly have with it is that it leaves an awful lot of people in complete limbo. They have no idea when their interviews are actually going to grant them the right to be able to work and have a life here. And then when they're placed on social housing lists, they don't know how long these housing lists are. So they're just left there waiting, trying to make something of themselves. And it's easier for them to live in a direct provision centre because that's all they know. There is no chance for them to be able to really integrate into their communities. Fair enough if they're granted asylum and they go off and they get an amazing job and it's wonderful for them and they're able to afford to be able to rent in this country, which I find very difficult, then more power to them. That's amazing, but that's not going to be everybody who is in direct provision. And I wouldn't blame a single person who has been there for years who thinks that this is all they can get, or who thinks that this is as good as it's going to get. Especially, as I said, when the standards vary so wildly. If someone is in a place that is particularly awful when it comes to provision, and that's all they've seen of this country, they might actually just think this is as good as it gets. So there may be absolutely no motivation to go and change the circumstances. Direct provision has also been likened to the privatisation of prisons over in America. So the way the prison system works in America is like here. It is a for-profit company that is paid by the government to look after incarcerated individuals. Similar to here, where private companies directly profit from the government paying to have refugees stay here. And they are giving them the absolute bare minimum. An awful lot of them are living in appalling conditions. There are an awful lot of arguments out there which will argue that, well, maybe they should just be sent back to their own countries. If we're taking in refugees from Yemen, for example, which is currently going through a war and a famine, I would much rather that people would stay here in comparison to Yemen. But if what we're providing is not any better, why are we allowing companies to directly profit from people who are just that vulnerable? It's not fair. It's not right. If you want to read an absolutely scathing article about it, and if you want to get unbelievably and justifiably angry about just how bad direct provision is for this country and for the people who are living in these conditions, I would recommend taking a look at this Irish Examiner piece that I'm going to link down below, written by Aoife Moore and Paul Hosford. I read it and I actually had to step away from my computer for an hour because I was so unbelievably angry and disgusted about how direct provision is not only handled in this country, but how just how expensive it is, and how it's such an unbelievable waste of money. And again, it's the same problem that I have with HAP. I think HAP is great because it gets people renting in a city that is so unbelievably unaffordable. But it also creates a baseline for what rent should be and then hikes it up even further past that point. And it's money that isn't cycling back into the government. It's money that's just going into the pockets of landlords who might not even need it. At least if it goes towards the government, you are actively paying for more social housing, for more supports, for more of what we actually need as a nation. And yes, it might even be paying for subsidised rents. But according to this Irish Examiner news article, over 1.2 billion has been paid into these private companies who look after people in direct provision for the last 20 years. If we just took that money and actually built these people some houses, we wouldn't have this issue. And that's the same issue that I have with HAP. If you took all the money that the government wasted on paying private landlords to sort this issue of social housing that they could solve if they just used that money to build places, then we wouldn't be in this hole that we've actually dug for ourselves. It's baffling. It doesn't make any sense to me. And again, I just don't know how we can budget our way out of this. That being said, I have received some very, very interesting figures. I have a friend who I'm not going to name, who's currently doing her PhD on the homelessness crisis in Ireland. And I asked her a couple of questions, one of them being, how much does the government actually make in revenue year on year from social housing? That includes people who pay HAP, because when you're on HAP or when you're on RAS, you pay 15% of whatever you earn to the government. Sorry I pointed, but I had to get my point across. So even when someone is on HAP, they are still paying the government. But again, that money that goes to the government goes back into paying for HAP. So it's just a complete waste of money. And HAP costs more than the money that you actually pay to the government when you're being socially housed, unless you earn an extortionate amount of money, which you wouldn't be anyway because you're on social housing. It's constantly working at a loss. But she sent me these figures and I found them very telling. I'm going to go into this a little bit more next week because I would like to change people's minds on what social housing is actually about, what it's good for, what it can be used for, that it can actually be profitable for our country, that it can be profits that can be cycled back in to the people who actually live here. And by people who live here, I'm including people who come over to stay here and people who have asylum. So if you really want to use your big galaxy brain and think about it for a second, think about how the government has spent 1.2 billion paying private companies for direct provision, and how they pay so much money year on year into subsidising people's rents to private landlords, and how that all could have been spent on just building places for these people instead, and cycling the money through the government. So if you didn't know what direct provision was, now you know. So I suppose now I'll do scary statistics. Now that I've gotten that rant out of my system. Just FYI, I'm really angry today, so I kind of feel like having a bit of a rant. Now, I've been told by my friend who is doing her PhD in the homelessness crisis that I shouldn't really be using the Focus Ireland statistics for homelessness because it's not really indicative of how many people are actively homeless. But it is indicative of how many people are currently using emergency accommodation. So what that means is people who are homeless and who have approached Focus Ireland or other homelessness charities and asked to be put into hostels in an emergency. And that emergency is because they've lost their home for whatever reason. But according to Focus Ireland's July statistics, there are over 8,000 homeless people currently in Dublin, and over 2,000 of those are children. And in Dublin alone, since the beginning of the year, 39 people have died on the street. As I said in my last video about scary statistics, if that doesn't frighten you, I don't know what does. We've all read the story about the homeless man who was attacked in Kilmainham a short while ago and was stabbed to death. And week on week, we're hearing even more about how people are continuously dying in the city centre. You know, Finland introduced a whole task force to deal with this. And while I appreciate that Hazel Chu, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, and that Dara O'Brien have, you know, a task force meeting once a week to try and tackle this issue, I know that it's not going to be solved overnight. I know it's not. And bear in mind that Finland took 10 years to solve this issue. It wasn't exactly solved overnight. But in Finland, what they did was they made housing a human right. And they treated the very first issue of homelessness, which was the fact that there is no home available. So they treated that issue first and foremost. If, like me, you're getting increasingly worried about this and you feel like you want to do something but you're not too sure what to do, on the 16th of October, Focus Ireland are hosting their annual Shine a Light, where it's an annual sleep-in or sleep-out in Dublin, where to raise awareness for the amount of people sleeping rough in Dublin, people are invited to raise money and sleep out for the evening on the 16th of October. I'm going to be attending this year. As soon as I set up a page for it, I will throw it up on the Twitter and the Instagram if I end up making an Instagram at any point, which I probably will because that's a plan. But I would recommend doing that. Or if you don't really want to do one small thing, then I would definitely recommend donating to your local homeless shelter or volunteering. Inner City Helping Homelessness is a great volunteer group to work with, so I would absolutely recommend them. But there's always Focus Ireland, there's DePaul. You can't really swing a cat in Dublin without hitting a homelessness charity. So I guess now I should go into housing news. So I haven't posted a video for 3 weeks to a month, and I thought I was going to have a lot to talk about, and I did, until this week. So if you haven't heard, this week Sinn Féin's spokesperson for housing, Owen O'Brien, I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I think it's Owen O'Brien. Owen O'Brien introduced a bill that was for debate in the Dáil, which was to ban rent increases for the next 3 years. Not a rent freeze, it was to ban rent increases for the next 3 years. And it was thrown out. In fact, the current Housing Minister, Dara O'Brien, didn't even stay to debate the issue. The argument against it was that Sinn Féin didn't consult any legal counsel on the issue to see if it was constitutional, which they did, and that the bill was only 100 lines long, which Owen O'Brien said it was meant to be very succinct. That was his reasoning around it. And that it wasn't going to solve the housing crisis. Now, I actually tweeted to Owen O'Brien to ask him a very short question about the bill, because I just wanted to know something very specific, and he answered me really quickly. And he was very short and to the point. He was also very clear in his statements when putting forward this bill that it was not going to solve the housing crisis. In no way on this earth was it going to solve the housing crisis. It wasn't touted that it was going to solve the housing crisis. It wasn't put forward as if it was going to. So I really don't understand this argument. I'm sorry, I'm really angry about this, because that's not what it was about. And I just have a suspicion that it was thrown out because it was Sinn Féin putting it forward. And I think about how my life would have been bettered. It would have been so much easier for me for the next 3 years on HAP to be able to afford housing. And I'm disgusted. I'm heartbroken. I'm speechless. Because it would have been such unbelievable benefit to everybody who rents here. And I know that there's rent pressure zones all over Dublin. Like, the entirety of Dublin is nearly a fucking rent pressure zone at this point. And it doesn't work. Rent still goes up year on year. Rents have risen every single year for the last 10 years. What are people supposed to do if it goes up next year? With the amount of people who are out of work, with the amount of people who've lost money because of this pandemic, what are we supposed to do? And rent cannot indefinitely rise because people can't afford it. And I'm sick of this argument that's like, oh, we'll rent a room. Yeah, but if rents are indefinitely rising, eventually a room won't be available to people. When does it end? There is no cut-off point. I don't get this argument, and it boils my piss. It really does. It just fucks me off. Like, I can't understand it at all. I'd love an explanation that makes sense, because that one does not make any sense. And like I said, I just feel like they threw it out because it's Sinn Féin. And I hate it. I hate it because last week I received a letter not from Darragh O'Brien specifically, but from his secretary. The letter was 5 pages long. And when I received it, I was so excited and I was so grateful because it explained so much. It got me really excited for how this government is handling the crisis and what they were going to do in the future. And I really thought, you know what? Darragh O'Brien has his head screwed on. You know, he's doing things that are, or wants to do things that are really going to be of benefit to the Irish people. And not just the Irish people, I mean any people who live in this country. You know, he's going to tackle these things head on, and it's going to be a multifaceted approach, and it sounds amazing. And there's loads of stuff that I'm not going to read out the letter, but there was loads of things that I want to talk about in it that to me were very interesting and very excited to hear because they were new and they were innovative, and I couldn't wait, you know, and then this happened. And then this happened. And I'm speechless. Because it just further reminds me that if Darragh O'Brien and Owen O'Brien worked together on these issues that affect us every day, if they really worked together, they could do so much good together. I genuinely believe that. I think they're both brilliant in their own right. I think they both have different approaches, but I genuinely believe at their heart they have the welfare of people who live here in mind. But when it came to the ban on rent increases, how does not agreeing with that actually have the interests of people in mind? The welfare of people who live here in mind. I don't understand it. On that note, I'm considering that this has been a very, very ranty video, and I'm really sorry about this, but I just had to get it out of my system. There are some good things that I wanted to bring up. And one of them was that Tua Housing is very close to finishing some of its social housing out in Rathcoole. So Tua Housing is an AHB. An AHB is an approved housing body. So they have a number of people on their books that they look after, and they've gotten money from the government to make social housing, and they're going to make that available to people out in Rathcoole. So that's really exciting, and that actually falls under housing news. And then again, is that I got a letter from the current Minister for Housing detailing what they want to do with housing in Ireland and how that's really exciting, and I want to talk about what they're going to do. As I said, I'm not going to read out the letter, mostly because I record this while I drive and it would be really unsafe to do so, but also it was a personal letter to me. But I will go over some of the points in it and some of the things that were brought up, and one of them is the idea of at-cost rental. So that's what my next video is going to be. Again, sorry for the rant, but I had to get that out of my system. And I'm very sorry about the long wait, because every time I recorded this, I realised that I just didn't know enough about direct provision, and I wasn't making the points that I wanted to make. And I also wasn't being sympathetic enough about it. I feel like I was very monotonous and just stating the facts, and I wasn't really going into just how difficult it was for people living in these conditions and living in direct provision. So I appreciate you for listening to my rant. Thank you very much. If you have any friends or family members who don't understand what direct provision is and you want to show them this video, please feel free to share it. I hope this has helped you gain some insight, and I'll see you next week. Also, if you could be an absolute ledge bag and follow me on Twitter, I'd really appreciate it. I do a lot of my ranting there. Oh.